I was the only IT guy keeping a 200-person company running. They refused to pay me overtime, so I made sure they paid everyone else instead. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Story Zone. Before we get into this one, hit that subscribe button right now because this is one of those stories where the revenge isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, and it doesn't involve a single raised voice. It involves a spreadsheet, a labor lawyer, and one man who understood a system so completely that when the people running it refused to treat him fairly, he used that same system to dismantle them from the inside. This is a story about what happens when a company mistakes a quiet person for a powerless one. Let's get into it. OP starts by saying, I want to tell you about Bob. Not because Bob is flashy or because this story ends with some dramatic boardroom confrontation. I want to tell you about Bob because Bob is the kind of person most companies don't understand until it's too late, the kind of person who shows up, does the work, keeps everything running, and says very little about any of it. The kind of person who, when pushed far enough, doesn't explode. He calculates. Bob is in his early 30s, based in Ontario, Canada. He's been in IT his whole career, bouncing between companies the way IT people do, picking up a new system here, a new skill set there, building a library of technical knowledge that most people couldn't describe and almost nobody could replicate. He's not the guy at the party telling stories about his job. He's the guy at the party who fixed your phone when it stopped working and refused to make a big deal about it. Detail-oriented, methodical, unbothered by recognition in a way that some people mistake for indifference but is actually just focus. Bob's superpower, and this matters for everything that follows, is that he doesn't just learn how systems work on the surface. He learns how they work underneath, the logic behind them, the data they generate, the reports they can produce if you know where to look. When Bob understands a system, he understands it completely. This is the kind of thing that is very useful when you're building something. Turns out it is equally useful when you've decided it's time to burn something down. The company Bob joined about 3 years before the story begins was a mid-sized service and distribution company based in Ontario. Decent size, around 200 employees when you counted everyone across departments. The kind of company that had been running on a patchwork of separate software systems for years. One program for dispatching, a different one for inventory, another for payroll and finances, and the daily operational reality of moving information between all of them manually, which is as tedious and error-prone as it sounds. The IT department was 2 people, Bob and a colleague. The workload was manageable. The environment was fine. Bob had worked in worse places and he settled in without complaint. Then the company decided to modernize. They were going to implement an ERP system, enterprise resource planning, and they wanted Bob's recommendation on which one to use. For those who don't know what an ERP system is, let me explain because it matters for everything that comes later. An ERP system is the central nervous system of a company. It handles everything. Purchase orders, sales, inventory, personnel, vendors, customers, shipping, receiving, all of it in one unified platform. When the receiver accepts a shipment at the loading dock and confirms the quantity in the system, that information is immediately visible to the sales team when a customer calls to ask what's in stock. When a salesperson closes a deal, the system updates the inventory automatically. When payroll runs, it pulls from the same dataset that tracks hours and attendance. Every department in the company uses it, each from their own corner of it, and the whole thing hums along as one interconnected machine. The ERP Bob recommended was one he knew from a previous employer, not just knew, but had lived inside. He understood its architecture, its reporting functions, its quirks, and its capabilities. He recommended it because it was the right tool for the job, and because he knew he could implement it properly. What he didn't fully account for was how completely the implementation would fall on his shoulders. The process took the better part of 8 months. Bob trained every department on their relevant functions, the receivers on receiving, the sales team on sales, the dispatchers on dispatch, the finance team on the full financial suite. He configured user permissions, built custom reports, troubleshot integration issues, answered tickets at all hours, and kept the operation running while simultaneously rebuilding it from the ground up. It was the kind of sustained, exhausting, technically demanding work that most people in the building didn't see and couldn't fully appreciate. When it was over and the system was running, there was no celebration, no acknowledgement, No particular recognition that one person had just completed the IT equivalent of rewiring a moving vehicle without stopping the engine. There was just the next morning and the next round of tickets. Bob's manager through all of this was a man named Andrew. Andrew had been at the company for 12 years. He was in his mid-40s, carried himself with the specific confidence of someone who had been in one place long enough to mistake tenure for expertise, and had a management style that could be summarized as apply pressure, deny resources, take credit. He had not been involved in the ERP implementation in any meaningful technical sense. He had attended the steering committee meetings, used words like rollout and go live and scalability in those meetings, and signed off on Bob's work as though the signing off were the difficult part. When the implementation succeeded, Andrew described it to the executive team as a smooth transition that the IT department had handled well. He did not specify which member of the two-person IT department had handled it almost entirely alone. The expansion came about a year after the ERP implementation. The company had been operating primarily in Ontario and decided to grow its footprint, marketing into Atlantic Canada to the east and British Columbia to the west. On paper, this was good news. In practice, it created an immediate operational problem that nobody had thought through carefully before announcing it. Atlantic Canada runs 90 minutes ahead of Ontario. An order placed at 8 in the morning in Halifax arrives in the Ontario system at 6:30 in the morning Ontario time, before most of the staff had started their day. British Columbia runs 3 hours behind. An email sent at 3 in the afternoon from Vancouver arrives at 6 in the evening Ontario time, after most of the staff had gone home. The result was a working day that had effectively stretched from before 6 in the morning to past 7 at night, with orders and communications arriving at both ends that nobody was there to handle. The company's solution was to stagger the IT department's shifts. Bob would move to 6 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. His colleague would cover 10:30 in the morning until 7 at night. Between them, the full extended day would be covered. The proposal was announced rather than discussed. Bob's colleague had 2 young children. The 10:30 to 7 shift was not compatible with school pickups, dinner, bedtime routines, the basic logistics of being a parent. He said so. The company insisted. His colleague quit. Bob was now the only IT person at a 200-person company operating across 3 time zones. Andrew told Bob they would find a replacement quickly. They posted the position at a salary that Bob's IT contacts, when he described it to them, found genuinely amusing, well below market rate for someone who could implement and operate an ERP system at this scale. The applications that came in were thin. The candidates who came in for interviews didn't have the ERP experience the role required. The search dragged on for months and then quietly stopped being discussed, the way things stop being discussed when the person managing them has decided the problem is solved because someone else is absorbing it. The someone else was Bob. I want to describe what Bob's days actually looked like during this period, because the revenge only means what it means if you understand the weight it was built on. Bob arrived at the office at 6 in the morning. By the time he sat down, there were already emails in his inbox, orders flagged from Atlantic Canada, system questions from staff who had come in early to handle the Eastern business, a hardware ticket from someone whose workstation had been acting up since the previous afternoon and who had submitted the request at 5:15 yesterday and wanted to know why it hadn't been addressed. Bob addressed it. Then the next one. Then the next one. The phones started around 7. By 9, the office was full and Bob was managing the full load of a normal IT day on top of the extended hours coverage that had been designed for 2 people and was now being handled by 1. He trained new hires on the ERP system, every new hire in every department, because Bob was the only person qualified to do it, and turnover in a company under this kind of operational pressure is never low. He handled hardware issues. He managed software updates. He took calls from the West Coast at 5:30 in the afternoon Ontario time, when he had technically been at work for 11 and a half hours already. His phone rang at dinner. Regularly. He would be sitting at his kitchen table and Andrew would call with something that needed to be addressed immediately, or a complaint about a ticket that hadn't been closed, or a question about why a report wasn't generating correctly, things that could have waited until morning and were being escalated at 7:30 in the evening because the company had expanded into time zones it hadn't staffed for, and Bob was the structural solution to that problem whether he had agreed to be or not. He asked for a raise. He sat down with Andrew and made the case clearly. The IT department was now 1 person instead of 2, He was covering hours that had been designed for a two-person operation, and the market rate for someone with his ERP expertise and the scope of his current responsibilities was significantly higher than his current salary of $58,000 a year. He had done his research. He knew what he should be making. The number was somewhere between $85,000 and $95,000, depending on the role definition. He wasn't asking for that. He was asking for something in the direction of it. Andrew told him the company appreciated his dedication and that compensation would be reviewed at the annual cycle. The annual cycle came. The raise was 3%. Bob's salary became $59,740. The market rate for his role remained $85,000. He asked for overtime pay. He had been tracking his hours carefully, the way detail-oriented people do when they suspect they might need the numbers later. He was consistently working 55 to 60 hours a week. Ontario labor law entitled salaried employees to overtime after 44 hours per week, 1.5 times their regular rate for every hour beyond that. At Bob's salary, his regular hourly rate worked out to approximately $28. The overtime rate was $42. He was working 11 to 16 hours of overtime every week. He had been doing this for 18 months. Andrew told him that IT specialists in Ontario were exempt from overtime provisions under the Employment Standards Act. He said it with the calm authority of someone who had looked this up specifically in preparation for this conversation. Bob went home and looked it up himself. Andrew was correct. The exemption was real and it applied to Bob's classification. He went back to work the next morning at 6. He answered the emails that had come in overnight. He trained a new hire in the receiving module. He took a call from Vancouver at 5:45 in the afternoon. He ate dinner. His phone rang. Bob had a network. IT people tend to. Years of moving between companies leaves you with contacts scattered across the industry, people you've worked alongside, people who understand what the job actually involves. Bob started having conversations with some of them around this period. Not about leaving yet, just talking, the way people do when something is wrong and they haven't fully decided what to do about it. What he heard back clarified things considerably. People he respected, doing jobs with comparable scope and complexity, were making between $80,000 and $100,000. One contact who had implemented an ERP system for a company of similar size described his compensation package, and Bob did the math quietly while they were talking. The gap between what Bob was making and what his skills were worth in the market was not a rounding error. It was a chasm. He went back to Andrew one more time. He had prepared for this conversation the way he prepared for everything. Thoroughly. He had salary data from 3 industry sources. He had a written summary of his current responsibilities, the hours he was working, the cost of replacing him with 2 people at market rate versus keeping him at his current salary. He laid it out clearly and professionally. He was not asking for anything unreasonable. He was asking to be paid somewhere in the vicinity of what his work was worth. Andrew listened to all of it. Then he said the company wasn't in a position to adjust compensation outside of the annual review cycle, that he appreciated Bob's contributions, and that this company needed people who were committed to the role and to the team. He said the last part in a tone that implied the conversation was over. Bob said thank you and went back to his desk. He opened his job search that evening and began it in earnest. While he was looking, something happened that was not planned but was entirely logical given who Bob was and what he had access to. He was in the ERP system, his system, the one he had built and configured and understood better than anyone else in the building, running a routine maintenance check. He had full administrative access to everything. Every module, every report, every log. The system tracked every user login and logout automatically. If you signed in at 7:15 in the morning and signed out at 6:40 in the evening, that data existed in the system with a timestamp. If you forgot to sign out, the system logged you out after 15 minutes of inactivity, so the data was clean. It had been logging this information since the day the ERP went live. Bob ran a report. Not for any particular purpose initially, just the instinct of a systems person who sees data and wants to understand what it says. The report pulled login and logout times for every non-management, non-supervisor employee in the company, all the way back to implementation day. 18 months of timestamps for approximately 64 people. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. Ontario labor law, the same Ontario labor law that Andrew had correctly cited to deny Bob overtime, stated that salaried employees who were not managers or supervisors were entitled to overtime pay after 44 hours per week. IT specialists were exempt, but receivers were not exempt. Customer service staff were not exempt. Dispatchers were not exempt. The sales coordinators logging in early to handle Atlantic Canada orders and staying late to cover Pacific Canada queries were not exempt. The warehouse staff whose hours had stretched with the time zone expansion were not exempt. The ERP system, which Bob had built, contained 18 months of precise timestamp data showing exactly when every one of these people had arrived and exactly when they had left. The math was not complicated. It was just a lot of it. Bob sat with this for 3 days before he did anything. He is not an impulsive person. The first call he made was to an employment lawyer. He explained the situation, what he had found, how he had found it, what he intended to do with it. He asked specifically whether referring employees to legal counsel on the basis of data he had accessed through his administrative role was legally permissible. The lawyer asked him several questions. Then she told him that the data was legitimately generated by a system he was authorized to access in the course of his job, that the labor law violations were real and documentable, and that informing employees of their legal rights was not only permissible but, in her view, the right thing to do. She gave him her contact information and told him to have people reach out. Bob built the spreadsheets, one for each of the 64 qualifying employees. Each sheet showed their login and logout times week by week going back to implementation day. It showed their regular hours, their overtime hours past 44 per week, and their overtime entitlement calculated at 1.5 times their regular hourly rate. He was meticulous about it. Every number was sourced directly from the system logs. Every calculation was verifiable. He had the lawyer review the methodology before he finalized anything. She confirmed it was clean. The total across all 64 employees came to $1.94 million in unpaid overtime. He read that number several times. He had known it was going to be significant. He had done enough back-of-envelope math while building the sheets to have a rough sense. But seeing the final figure, precise to the dollar, was something else. $1.94 million. The company had been sitting on that liability since the day the time zone expansion stretched everyone's hours past 44 per week, and nobody had looked, because nobody with the access and the inclination to look had ever had a reason to do so. Until now. Bob lined up his new job. The offer came from a company that had been looking for someone with exactly his ERP expertise and offered him $88,000 a year plus benefits. He accepted without negotiating because the number was already fair and he had other things on his mind. He handed in his 2 weeks' notice. He thanked his colleagues. He cleaned out his desk over a Tuesday afternoon. On his last day he shook some hands, said some goodbyes, and drove home. He spent that evening finishing the spreadsheets. The morning after his last day, at 8:15, every non-management employee at the company received an email from Bob's personal account. The subject line read, "You are legally entitled to overtime pay." The body of the email was 3 sentences. It explained that Ontario labor law entitled non-management salaried employees to overtime after 44 hours per week, that the attached spreadsheet showed their personal overtime hours as recorded by the company's own ERP system going back 18 months. And that the lawyer listed below had been briefed on the situation and was available to discuss their options. The attachment was their individual spreadsheet. Their name at the top. Their hours week by week. Their total overtime entitlement, calculated to the dollar. For some employees, the number was in the low thousands. For others, the ones who had been absorbing the most of the time zone expansion, it was considerably higher. The average across the 64 was just over $30,000. Bob made coffee. He took the dog for a walk. He did not check his phone for 2 hours. When he did check his phone, there were 4 missed calls from a number he recognized. He had not saved it as a contact. He had deleted Andrew's number on his last day as a small, private act of finality. But he knew the digits. He did not call back. Andrew called again at 11:15. Bob answered. The conversation lasted about 6 minutes. Andrew's voice had a quality Bob had not heard from him before. Not the performative authority of the man who denied raises and called at dinner time with non-urgent complaints, but something tighter and less controlled. He wanted to know what Bob had done. He said the word chaos at least twice. He said the lawyer's name with a specific kind of anger that suggested someone who has been confronted with a consequence they had not considered possible. Then he said, "I know it was you." Bob let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Andrew, everything in those spreadsheets came directly from the company's own ERP system. The hours are what they are. The law is what it is. You told me yourself Ontario labor law is very clear on these things. I learned that from you." Andrew said some other things. Bob waited until he was done. Then Bob said, "I hope you find someone who's committed to the role," and ended the call. He did not hear from Andrew again. What followed over the next several weeks was, by any accounting, spectacular. 51 of the 64 employees authorized the lawyer to negotiate with the company on their behalf. Several others consulted with their own lawyers independently. A small number decided not to pursue it for personal reasons, which was their right, but the majority had seen their individual numbers and decided that $30,000 or $40,000, or in a few cases considerably more, was worth a conversation with a lawyer. The company, which had approximately zero warning that this was coming and no legal strategy prepared for it, found itself negotiating simultaneously with a single lawyer representing 51 employees on the basis of documentation pulled directly from their own system. There was no credible dispute about the hours. The system logs were the system logs. There was no credible dispute about the law. Andrew had cited it correctly to Bob, and it applied equally to everyone else. The only question was the settlement number, and the only leverage the company had in that negotiation was the time and cost of litigation, which the lawyer, having reviewed the documentation, was apparently not particularly concerned about. The settlement totaled $1.94 million in back overtime payments. Legal fees and administrative costs brought the total to approximately $2.28 million. Bob heard the final number from a former colleague about 2 months after it settled. He was at his new job by then, making $88,000 a year, working normal hours, not answering his phone at dinner. He received the information, said something like, "Huh," and went back to what he was doing. The math was not lost on him. The company had refused to give him a raise to market rate, a difference of $27,000 per year. They had refused to address his overtime, which he calculated he was personally owed approximately $47,000 for the period he had tracked. To avoid paying one IT employee fairly, to save at most $74,000, they had generated a liability of $2.28 million that had been sitting in their own system the entire time, logged automatically, waiting for someone with the access and the inclination to find it. The system Bob had built, that he had implemented and trained and configured and maintained for 3 years while being underpaid and overworked and told to be grateful for the opportunity, had been the instrument of their undoing. He found that satisfying in the way that very precise things are satisfying. Neat, proportionate, clean. Andrew was terminated 6 weeks after the settlement. Bob heard about this from the same former colleague, in a message that arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the energy of someone who had been waiting to deliver the news. The board's review of how the overtime liability had accumulated and gone unaddressed for 18 months identified the management layer as the point of failure. Andrew had known about the time zone expansion. Andrew had managed the IT department through the period when the hours stretched. Andrew had signed off on the salary reviews. Andrew, it turned out, was the person who had been copied on the original employment lawyer consultation that Bob had flagged to HR 18 months earlier as a question about IT specialist exemptions. A consultation that had apparently confirmed the exemptions applied to Bob without anyone pausing to consider whether the same question had been asked about the other 64 employees it didn't apply to. Andrew had been at the company for 12 years. He was escorted out on a Tuesday morning. Bob received this information, thanked his colleague for the update, and returned to his afternoon. For months after the settlement, on a Saturday, Bob was running errands. He needed printer paper, a new surge protector, and something for dinner, and the most efficient route took him past a large electronics and home goods retailer on the edge of town. He went in. He found the surge protectors in the third aisle. He found the printer paper near the back. He was heading toward the checkout when he saw, behind the register in aisle 7, a man in a blue company polo shirt scanning a customer's items with the focused, slightly blank expression of someone who is performing a task and not thinking about it too hard. The man was Andrew. Bob stood in the aisle for a moment. Andrew had not seen him yet. He looked in the way that people look when a context has shifted completely around them, smaller than Bob remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, the same build, but something about the polo shirt and the register and the particular quality of the fluorescent light made him seem less like the person who had called Bob at dinner time with the authority of someone who owned the night. Bob got in line. He waited. When he reached the front, Andrew looked up from the register, and the recognition moved across his face in a way that was difficult to describe. Not guilt exactly, not shame exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has been caught existing in a context they would have preferred to keep private. Andrew said, "Bob." Bob placed his items on the belt. He let Andrew scan the surge protector. He let him scan the printer paper. Then, while Andrew was processing the transaction, Bob looked at him with the same pleasant, neutral expression he had worn in every meeting where Andrew had told him the company wasn't in a position to adjust compensation at this time, and said, "Andrew, looks like you found a role you're really committed to." He paid. He took his bag. He walked out into the parking lot and drove home. He did not look back. Here is where Bob is now. He has been at his new company for just over a year. He makes $88,000 a year. He works a normal schedule. His phone does not ring at dinner. When he identifies a problem in the system, he documents it, submits it through the proper channel, and it gets addressed because the company he works for has a functional IT department with more than one person in it, and a management team that appears to have grasped the basic concept that infrastructure requires investment. He does not think about the old company very often. When he does, it is without bitterness. Bitterness requires ongoing investment in a thing, and Bob has redirected his investments. What he feels, when he thinks about it at all, is something closer to the clean satisfaction of a well-designed system doing exactly what it was designed to do. He built the tool. The tool generated the data. The data documented what was true. What was true was used to hold the company accountable for what it had done. He didn't bend any rules. He didn't access anything he wasn't authorized to access. He didn't lie or fabricate or manipulate. He read the system correctly, which was, after all, the thing he had always been paid, if not well, to do. The company spent $2.28 million to avoid paying one IT employee fairly. The liability had existed from the day they expanded into new time zones without thinking carefully about what that expansion would cost. Bob didn't create it. He just found it. And then he made sure 64 people who had been working overtime without compensation found it too. Andrew told Bob once that this company needed people who were committed to the role. Bob was committed to the role. He was committed to it for 3 years at 6 in the morning at dinner time on weekends for $58,000 a year while the job was worth $90,000. The company mistook that commitment for something they were entitled to. They found out at a cost of $2.28 million that they were not. Some lessons are expensive. This one was precise. If this one stayed with you, and I think it did, you know what to do. Subscribe to the Story Zone, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what was the moment that got you the most? Was it the email? Was it the phone call? Or was it the parking lot? Because I have a feeling that looks like you found a role you're really committed to is going to live in my head for a while. We'll see you in the next one.